Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking a close look at Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, or at least the thought-provoking excerpts you sent in. And let me tell you, folks, these excerpts cover some really massive questions for humanity. We're talking about AI, the future of jobs, and what it even means to be human in a world that seems to change by the minute.
Oh, it's definitely fascinating. And what I find really compelling about Harari is that he doesn't shy away from turning our assumptions upside down.
Yeah.
He takes us on a wild ride through all these complex ideas, and he manages to do it in a way that makes you think, wow, I never thought of it that way before.
You're so right. He really makes you re-examine everything you thought you knew. So why don't we dive right in? Let's unpack some of the key ideas you sent us, and maybe a good place to start is with this idea of liberalism facing a crisis. Now, just to be clear, when we talk about liberalism here, we're talking about the big picture, the political and economic system that puts individual freedom, democracy, and free markets front and center.
Right, exactly. Like this system that for decades has been kind of the main driving force in global politics.
And I think after, the fall of fascism and communism, there was this feeling that, okay, this is it. Liberalism is going to be the dominant force everywhere.
Yeah, like we had reached the end of history, as some people called it. But Harari throws a wrench in that idea, doesn't he? He argues that actually liberalism is facing some pretty big hurdles in the 21st century. He points to things like inequality, the growing gap between the rich and everyone else. And of course, we can't forget political polarization, the way people seem to be getting further and further apart in their political views. And then there's the whole resurgence of nationalism, this idea that, wait a minute, maybe we were wrong about this whole globalized world.
So it really makes you wonder, if liberalism is having all these problems, what comes next? And that's where Harari takes us into some really interesting territory, because he suggests technology, especially this combination of artificial intelligence and biotechnology, that's going to have a huge impact on what the future holds for all of us.
That's where we start to enter this weird space where science fiction suddenly feels a lot like reality. We're not just talking about robots replacing us in boring jobs. Harari suggests that AI might actually become better than humans at things we thought were, like our special skills, creativity, understanding emotions, even solving complex problems.
It's a little unsettling to think about, right? Like,
Yeah.
what happens to us if machines can do almost everything better than we can? And Harari doesn't sugarcoat it. He uses this really stark phrase, the useless class, to talk about the possibility of a lot of people becoming irrelevant, not just in terms of jobs, but in society as a whole.
It's a wake-up call, that's for sure.
Sure.
It makes you think, what can I do to make sure I don't get left behind while technology keeps moving at warp speed?
Okay, so we've got this potential crisis of liberalism. We've got technology changing the world faster than we can keep up. And then to make things even more complicated, Harari says data is becoming the most valuable thing on the planet, which creates a whole new set of opportunities and challenges.
He tells this really interesting story in the book about how the descriptions for his own books are actually written specifically for Google's algorithms, not even for people to read.
Really?
It's wild.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show how much these data systems are already controlling our lives in ways we probably don't even realize.
It makes you think about your own data trail. Every website you visit, every purchase you make, every interaction you have online is creating data that someone can collect and analyze. And that data can be used to influence how you act, what you buy, even what you believe.
It's pretty mind-blowing, right? And maybe a little bit creepy, too.
Absolutely. And it raises some huge questions about things like privacy and who actually has control over all this information. Harari even connects this to AI and says if our choices are being manipulated by algorithms that we barely understand, what does that mean for our freedom? Are we really in control of our own lives anymore?
That's a great point. He calls it the knowledge illusion, this idea that we often overestimate how much we actually understand, especially when we're bombarded with so much information all the time.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all fallen for that one at some point.
And Harari is concerned that AI could take advantage of that by feeding us personalized information that just reinforces what we already think, even if it's wrong. It could prevent us from really thinking critically and challenging our own beliefs.
So instead of helping us make better decisions, AI could actually be used to manipulate us.
Think about self-driving cars. We're already having to think about these ethical dilemmas, like in an accident that the car can't avoid, who should it protect? A human driver might make a split-second decision based on instinct, but an AI system is going to be following whatever algorithms it's been programmed with. So who gets to decide what those algorithms should be? And what happens when those decisions have life or death consequences?
It's a lot to consider, and that's just scratching the surface of the issues Harari brings up. It's definitely made me rethink my own relationship with technology. How about you?
Me too, for sure. Makes you look at everything a bit differently. And speaking of looking at things differently, Harari also talks about this resurgence of nationalism in the 21st century. Kind of
Well,
surprising, right?
it does seem counterintuitive. The world is more interconnected than ever, but we're seeing this intense focus on national identity. Like people are pulling back from global cooperation.
Yeah, it's a paradox. But Harari suggests that it's partly a reaction to all the stuff we've been discussing. The rapid pace of technology, the anxieties of globalization. It's like people are yearning for that sense of belonging and stability. And for a lot of people, that means holding on to their national identity.
But as you mentioned, it's kind of a paradox because Harari also points out that nationalism isn't going to solve the big, truly global problems.
No, exactly. Like climate change, for instance, or global pandemics. These issues need countries to work together, to think of themselves as part of a bigger human family.
He actually uses Brexit as an example, right? He says it's a case study in how nationalism can get in the way of effectively tackling those complex global issues. He suggests that if we're going to thrive in the 21st century, we need to develop a whole new way of thinking about ourselves, a new global consciousness.
And that leads perfectly into another area that Harari delves into, which is the role of religion. He acknowledges that religion can be incredibly powerful for good and for bad.
Absolutely. It's not black and white. He gives all sorts of examples, both of the positive and the negative.
Right. On one hand, religion can inspire amazing acts of compassion, generosity, a real sense of community. But at the same time, it can also be used to justify things like violence, discrimination, and prejudice.
He doesn't shy away from either side of the argument, and I think that's what makes his discussion of religion so relevant, especially in a world where religious tensions are, sadly, running pretty high.
It makes you think, how does religion fit into this rapidly changing world? How will it evolve as technology and society continue to transform?
It really does. And this whole idea of religion evolving kind of brings us to another important point that Harari makes. He keeps coming back to the need for humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, especially as we try to navigate this crazy, complicated world.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about it all the time. Recognizing the limits of our own knowledge, he says, is crucial for making good decisions. And it's more important than ever now that we're constantly bombarded with information.
He calls it the knowledge illusion, right? We
Yeah.
think we know more than we do.
Exactly. I think the internet makes it even worse because we have all this information at our fingertips. It creates this illusion of infinite knowledge.
Yeah, and it's so easy to fall into that trap.
But Harari argues that true wisdom is actually about recognizing what you don't know. It's about being open to new information, being willing to admit when you're wrong, and considering different perspectives.
So it's not about having all the answers, but knowing which questions to ask.
Exactly. He encourages us to develop this intellectual humility. Basically, it's the ability to step back from your own biases, your own assumptions, and really engage with different points of view, even if they challenge your beliefs.
Which, let's be honest, can be hard. Especially these days when it's so easy to get stuck in your own little echo chamber online. You only see information that confirms what you already think.
It's true. And it makes it really hard to have meaningful conversations, to really understand the issues, and to make informed decisions if we're not willing to listen to people who disagree with us.
It's a big challenge. So what's the solution? Does Harari offer any advice on how to break out of these echo chambers?
Well, he talks a lot about the importance of education, but not just in the traditional sense, like memorizing facts and figures.
Right.
He sees education as a lifelong process of developing critical thinking skills.
Being able to analyze information and figure out what's reliable and what's not.
Yes. And he also emphasizes emotional intelligence and being adaptable. Because let's face it, the world is changing so fast. Who knows what the job market will even look like in a few years?
Exactly. What skills will be in demand? What problems will we need to solve? It's a little scary to think about.
It is. But that's why he emphasizes being able to learn new things, to adjust to new situations. And I love how he talks about emotional intelligence, being able to understand and manage your own emotions and being empathetic toward others.
Especially in a world where AI might be able to do a lot of the things humans do. Those uniquely human qualities like empathy and compassion will become even more important.
Absolutely. It's what makes us human, right? And that brings us to another profound question that Harari explores. How do we find meaning in a world where all the old stories are kind of falling apart?
Yeah, those big narratives that used to give us a sense of purpose.
Right. Religion, nationalism, even the idea of progress. A lot of those stories are losing their power, and it leaves people feeling a bit lost. Like, where do we find meaning and purpose in a world that feels chaotic and uncertain?
It's something we all struggle with at some point, right?
Really.
Yeah.
And Harari is very honest about his own search for meaning. He talks about his experience with meditation, not in a religious or mystical way, but as a way to train the mind.
To become more aware of your own thoughts and emotions.
Exactly.
Huh.
And he says that through meditation, you can develop this sense of inner peace, even when the world around you is crazy.
It's almost like a science experiment. You're observing your own mind without judgment.
It's fascinating. He's basically taking that rigorous analytical approach he uses as a historian and applying it to the human mind itself.
And the idea is that by understanding our minds better, we can become less reactive, less controlled by our emotions.
Yes, and that inner freedom is crucial, especially when the world is throwing all these challenges at you.
So it's not about escaping reality, but about finding the inner strength to face reality head on.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads us to one of the most profound and maybe a bit unsettling ideas in Harari's work. The idea that the most real thing in the world is suffering.
Yeah, that one really made me stop and think. It sounds kind of pessimistic.
It does. But I don't think he's saying we should just wallow in misery and give up.
Right.
I think he's saying that suffering is just an inevitable part of being human. We can't avoid it. But by understanding it, by facing it, we can actually find a deeper meaning in life.
Because it forces us to confront the fact that nothing stays the same. Everything is constantly changing. We're changing. The world's changing. And that can be scary.
It can be. But it's also kind of liberating. It makes you realize that you don't have control over everything, and that's okay.
It's like a wake-up call. And I think that's really what Harari is trying to do. He's trying to wake us up to the realities of the world, to challenge our assumptions, and to empower us to make choices about the kind of future we want to create.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into our next point.
Which is, well, I was going to ask you, what does all of this mean for our listeners? What can they take away from all this mind-bending stuff?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? What do we do with all this? If I had to boil it all down to one action, one thing our listeners could do today, inspired by Harari, it would be to cultivate awareness.
Awareness, okay. Can you elaborate on that? What does that actually look like in practice?
It means paying attention to the stories you're consuming, the narratives that are shaping your worldview. Think about what you're reading, what you're watching, what you're listening to.
Because stories are powerful. They can inspire us, but they can also mislead us or even be harmful.
Oh, absolutely. And that's especially true today with the internet. Misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Yeah, it's incredible. And AI is getting better at creating fake news, too. It's becoming harder and harder to distinguish what's real from what's not.
It's terrifying, which is why it's so important to be really careful about what information you let in. Question everything.
So it's not just about being informed, it's about being critically informed, knowing where information comes from, what biases might be at play, and what agendas might be behind it.
Exactly. And it's not just about news and information. It's about everything. What you buy, the relationships you form, the choices you make. It's about being present in your life, paying attention, and making conscious decisions.
It might even mean questioning those narratives we've always believed about ourselves, our purpose, who we are.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but it feels important.
Oh, it is. It's essential. But, you don't have to do it alone. Harari gives us tools, a framework for making sense of this crazy, complex world we're living in.
He reminds us that we're not just passengers on this planet. We're the crew. We can steer the ship.
And that's a really powerful message. We're not powerless. We have the ability to shape our future.
I love that. So to wrap up, if you had to leave our listeners with one challenge, one thought to ponder, what would it be?
That's a good one. I guess I'd ask, what's one small step you can take today, inspired by these ideas, to become a more conscious, engaged, and responsible citizen of the world?
That's a great challenge. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the work of Yuval Noah Harari. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning. Until next time.